Hi everyone, this is Hardy. In this lecture we will take a look at some amazing ways you can use Photoshop brushes to get some incredible effects. So far this course has been pretty heavy on information. It might be starting to feel a little bit like school. So from here on out, I promise it will only be fun stuff. In this lecture I'll show you the brushes that I use, but I'll also walk you through how to make your own. Before we get too far along in this section, I need to tell you all that there is no magic tool or button that can make great looking art. These special tools that I'll show you how to use are really great, and they can help create beautiful effects when used artfully, but use these with great restraint. These tools get addictive, and nothing shows an amateur more obviously than a painting full of leaf brush stamps everywhere. Remember that practice and good technique are the surest paths to success. And these special tools, namely custom brushes and custom shapes, are just one small part of the well-rounded overall skill set that you'll use to create amazing art. Okay, with that small word of caution out of the way, let's check out all the ways we can customize brushes. I've got a pack of very cool brushes that I've developed that are all available for download as ABR files. These are really easy to install by clicking on the Brush Preset Picker, clicking the small gear icon, and then clicking Import Brushes. There may be subtle variation in these steps depending on which version of Photoshop you have, but the basics are all the same. I'll also show you how to make your own custom brushes in this lecture. Let's go over some brush basics. Hit F5 anytime you want to bring up the brush editor. Each brush is comprised of a brush tip shape, which we can inspect in this first window. Lots of brush shapes here, but for now, let's just check out a simple circle. We can edit the size of the brush tip shape either by sliding this size bar or by hitting the bracket keys up or down to enlarge or shrink any brush. Here you'll also find the shape roundness editor. This lets us either flatten out or even rotate the shape of our brush tip. This can be nice if you want to transform a circle into an angled oval for a nice calligraphic effect. See how nicely that works? I'll return this brush to its previous shape, and next we'll check out how these handles can edit hardness and spacing. Hardness only applies to this basic round brush. If we reduce the hardness, the edges of the brush get soft and less defined. This is really nice if you want to do some soft airbrush work. If you hold down Shift and hit the bracket keys, you can edit the brush hardness on the fly, a super handy shortcut. Spacing is another interesting shape adjustment we can make. Photoshop is actually stamping down your brush tip shape in rapid sequence every time you draw a line. The spacing editor controls how often those stamps are happening. The default is usually 25%, and this is enough to give the impression of a continuous line unless you are zoomed way in. If you increase the spacing, you can see it starts making your continuous line look more like a series of dots. These effects can be cool to try, so certainly play around with this if you want. I rarely have any need to put the spacing below 25%, and it can cause processor lag time in your brush work if you do. Okay, that's about it for the brush tip shape editor. Now let's look at some of the amazing jitters and other effects we can apply to any brush tip shape. Shape dynamics. This is a very important one. I like to keep control of size jitter set to pin pressure. This gives our lines that great thin to thick control depending on how hard we press on our pressure sensitive tablet. We can adjust the size jitter to give our brush some random variation in line thickness. You can also set a minimum brush diameter with this handle if you don't want your lines to taper down too much. Next is angle jitter, which adds rotation to your brush tip shape. And finally, we have roundness jitter, which kind of squashes the shape of the brush. Each of these jitters has a drop down to let you choose which factor controls the jitter. I typically reserve pin pressure for my brush tip size, but you may find other configurations that work better for you. Already you can start to see the dizzying number of possibilities for each brush tip shape, and these are just the Photoshop defaults. Next, let's take a look at scattering, and I think I'll check these boxes individually because these effects start to get really complex when you stack them on top of one another. Scattering is very cool and pretty self-explanatory. With this jitter, you can sort of speckle around your brush tip shape, and with scatter, count, and count jitter, you can control how far out from the center line the shapes occur and how many there are. This can be handy if you want to create a brush for debris or snow or falling leaves, for example. The next one on this list is texture. I actually don't use this one much, but it lets you assign and adjust an underlying texture to your brush. This can provide some very cool depth and layering to your work. Very cool stuff. Dual brush can have a similar effect. What this does is subtract away from your brush stroke with a different brush. It's sort of like you're painting with one brush and erasing away parts with another, all in a single brush move. You have full control over which brush tip shape you use for this effect, and you can even fine-tune it with size, spacing, scatter, and count. I really like dual brush because it does a nice job of randomizing each brush stroke. A problem with a lot of Photoshop brushes is that they start to look like the same stamped pattern repeating over and over, which makes it look very phony and computer generated. Dual brush really helps shake things up and can avoid this effect. Color dynamics is also kind of self-explanatory. It lets you assign a jitter to any number of color modifiers such as hue and brightness. I like to use this when using a brush to paint trees or foliage. You can give your vegetation a nice subtle modulation so that it doesn't seem so uniformly green. Finally, we have transfer. This lets you assign a jitter for both flow and opacity so you can modulate the intensity and boldness of your brushwork. A very nice way to add some randomness and interest to your brush. I always have smoothing checked, but otherwise I tend to leave these other jitters alone. The best way to familiarize yourselves with how these functions work is to just grab a brush and start messing around with each jitter. It can lead to some really fun and unexpected results. Now that you understand the basics, let's try to make our own custom brush. Photoshop makes this really easy. For this exercise, let's make a brush for painting leaves on a tree. First, we'll need to create some shapes. Obviously, these early choices are very important since this shape will determine what the brush will look like. I'll use black and a round brush to paint a few leaf shapes. While I'm creating these, I'm mainly keeping in mind that this collection of shapes will be repeated over and over, so I want them to look fairly random but uniform enough so that there isn't an outlier that is noticeable. Okay, now that I've got these shapes painted in solidly, I'll command-click the layer that they are on to create a selection of these pixels. From there, we go to Edit, Define Brush Preset. We'll give it a name, and just like that, our new brush tip shape is now visible in our brush library. Pretty cool, right? Our work isn't done yet. Now let's start tinkering with all of the jitters that we've just discussed to see if we can make this look like a cool tool and a useful brush for painting some realistic looking leaves. Okay, so there we have it. You now have the power to create and adjust your own brushes. Enjoy this powerful tool and use it artfully to add texture, detail, and richness to your work.